and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well. In this video, I want to talk about some products or things that I feel you don't really need, or things that maybe I bought at the beginning of my plant hobby journey that I no longer use and maybe have differing opinions on. So these are things that I don't really think that you need. This would be maybe particularly helpful for people starting out, or maybe people that have been in the hobby for a long time, likely even longer than me, and maybe these are things that you still use, or maybe these are things you agree with me on. So like many people, my plant hobby kind of exploded during early 2020 in the lockdown, and during that time I got a lot of my plants really fast, and with that came an extremely steep learning curve and a lot of dead plants. So I think I probably will do some videos in the future on what are my reflections of the beginning time of that hobby for me personally. Things I wish I didn't do, or things I would do differently if I was to do it again. Not that I regret anything, but you know, it's always helpful to look back on these things. So during that time, I also got caught up in a lot of the, I guess, marketing that is present around plant care and what that commercial side of things is like. And in that commercial world, there are a lot of products that are advertised that are kind of pushed on you as being necessary to take care of plants. And these are things that I fell into and that I don't necessarily agree with anymore. Now, all of these things are, of course, my personal opinion, and it does not mean that I'm right, and it does not mean that you have to stop using them if you have them, or if you want to buy something that you feel that you shouldn't. That is totally up to you. This is based on my experience only, and I just thought it would be fun to go through some of these things as they are quite popular. So the first thing on my list is a water meter. I think my feelings around this are a little bit complicated, because while that is something I definitely do not use anymore, I do think it can be beneficial when you are learning about watering your plants and what that means, and what dry soil means versus wet soil versus saturated versus moist, etc, etc. It can be helpful to kind of learn from that. The reason I don't use it anymore is because I like the very traditional method of using my fingers in the soil. I just stick my finger into the pot, and that is how I've gotten used to what I understand is super dry soil, wet soil, or moist soil, and that is how I actually determine every single one of my plants when they need to be watered. What I also use is, because I've had most of my plants for the majority of that time, because I haven't bought that many new plants in the last year and a half, 2 years, I also use the weight of the pots, because over time you understand what weight, how your pots feel when they're really wet and how they feel when they're dry. But that is something that only comes when you've had your plant for a long time. So the water meter can be useful because you can stick it in the soil, and it basically gives you a range of, I think, from 1 to 10 on how wet the soil actually is. Now, the reason I don't think these are very accurate is because this also massively depends on your substrate. It depends where you're sticking the end tip of that probe in the pot. If you are touching it on the side, that may be drier. If you're touching a perlite stone, which is dry, but the rest of it is wet, they aren't super accurate, but they can give you an indication of where things are. And so I think it's useful to have at the beginning of your plant care to use that in conjunction with touching the soil with your skin or your fingers, so that you can kind of learn what moist soil means, what wet soil means, etc, etc. But after some time, once you get more familiar with what that means, it's no longer really needed, and it's not very useful. The only situation in which I think it could be useful is maybe in some really giant pots that you cannot simply reach down to the bottom of the pot to see if they're wet. Now with any big pots I have like that, I just kind of know when they're dry based off weight, based off how dry the first layer is, etc., how long it's been since I've watered, blah blah blah. So yeah, it's something I definitely don't use anymore, and I do not think is necessary. You can totally also begin your plant care journey by not using it and just learning along the way. But I think that it is much more beneficial to know the moisture of your substrate based off your fingers or based off yourself, because that is much more intuitive and it can give you a bit more nuance with how dry things are, how wet things are, etc. The second thing on this list is a humidifier. Now, I do have a humidifier. I do not use it anymore. I did use it for quite a while, and these are my thoughts on it. Humidifiers, in my opinion, only really work when you are in quite an enclosed environment, like a greenhouse, a big terrarium, that kind of situation. Then I think it can be very useful because the humidity that it is creating and increasing the humidity level is very enclosed and it can't be kind of dispersed through the air. Now, in a room like this one or the room in my previous house that I used to grow in, it's not useful in a situation like that because it just disperses into the wider room. On top of that, it isn't very good to have constant humidity on the floors or carpets of your house. And in a bigger space, they are so kind of, what's the word? They only really affect the small area around the humidifier. And so the plants that are benefiting from it are usually plants that are either sitting on top of the humidifier or immediately beside it, and the rest of the plants don't really feel any effect from that because it's such a big space and it just gets lost in it. In the future, if I did try a little greenhouse or terrarium or something, I may use it, and that's why I've actually kept it, because it was expensive. I think it was like 95 euros or 100 euros, so it was I think quite an expensive plant product to get, and so I don't want to just get rid of it. It's perfectly good, it works really well. I have no issues with the brand or the type that I got, which I will put on the screen or in the description box. That is perfect. It's more like in general humidifiers that I just really don't feel are very necessary in a situation like this where you're just growing houseplants in your home like that. It really has to be in an enclosed environment where you're taking things really seriously and you're really trying to have the perfect conditions for certain types of plants. On top of that, my plant care style is quite lazy and it's quite minimal, and the amount of filling up of the humidifier, which was maybe a daily or 2-day occurrence, with a lot of water. That's another thing actually. The water usage is huge on those things, and it just disperses into the atmosphere in the environment in that room. On top of that, the cleaning is I found very awkward and annoying. All the little parts that you have to clean, and there's algae buildup and salt buildup and stuff like that, and it just wasn't. It's just not for me. It's just another thing you have to do. And when you have as many plants as I do, that's just another annoying job that takes away from actually caring for the plants. And it's just not one that I felt was really necessary or having any effect on my plants whatsoever because of how my setup is. So that being said, if you are starting out and your plant care setup is similar to mine, like a shelf or even windows in your house or something like that, it's just really not necessary. It's just not that serious. If you are getting into more trickier plants and you want to have a greenhouse or terrarium situation, then go for it. They will do the job in that scenario. The third one is probably one that is quite controversial, because I think that out of everything on this list, this is probably the most widely used by everyone I see in the hobby, and that is moss poles. Now, by moss poles, I mean everything from actual sphagnum moss poles, the coir mat poles that are tied with string that you get in garden centers, the plastic setups that have moss inside them or various different types of bark and things like that. I'm talking about all of these things collectively. They are sold widely in online stores, garden centres, and they are also used widely by a lot of people. If you've been watching me for a while, you know that I do not use them. I have tried to use them at the beginning of this hobby and they just never really worked for me. I never thought that they were the right substrate. I never got aerial roots to fully actually grip onto them at all. I do feel that a lot of the ones that actually use moss would have to be wet, and that is again another thing that you have to be watering and monitoring all the time. On top of that, I do not use sphagnum moss in my plant care hobby whatsoever. My stance on that is very clear. I do have videos on sphagnum moss, sustainability issues, etc., and why I don't use it is very clear in those videos. In very short, I don't believe that I have ever seen a sustainable sphagnum moss product with one that I can actually successfully trace back to where it came from, and that I don't feel comfortable with, because sphagnum moss, if you don't know, actually originate from blanket bog type habitats, which are a very protected habitat, especially in Ireland, and are very rare across the world in general. This is why people use peat-free soil and compost, etc., etc. It is along the lines of the same thing, taken from the same habitat. Of course, you can grow sphagnum moss from a very small amount, but I always find it really hard to figure out where a company is doing this. Are they growing it in a warehouse? Blah, 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 blah. So that's why I don't use it. That has been obviously a big turn off of moss folds in general for me. But then as far as the coir mat poles, I've just never found them to really work. That could be because the environment I had was not humid enough. I didn't have the other conditions correct enough to make these things work. But I've also used alternatives that have actually worked far better for me, and this is why I don't think it is something that you necessarily need. You may know that I use branches, dead branches that I've collected from various different whatever places, walks, old places we've lived, etc. And I use them for structure, stability, and for growing my vertical climbing plants on, and they've always worked really well. They are free, they do not decompose fast enough for me to even notice, and I've used them for years now. And I've also recycled the same ones. I haven't actually collected branches in 2 years. I've just used the same ones. I think they look nicer aesthetically. And yeah, there's just been absolutely no reason for me to not use that. On top of that, I have tried this year a cork board climbing wall, which has done exceptionally well. I would argue even better than the branches as well, because it gives a nice lateral space. Also cheaper, and you can go multiple plants on it as well. So those options are much more manageable for me. I think I've been much more successful with it. I think they are cheaper, and I generally just don't think that moss poles, as the ones that I'm discussing, are actually necessary for these types of plants at all. The next one is also probably a bit controversial, and I think this one is much more a kind of personal opinion. Well, they're all personal opinions, but the reason this never worked for me is definitely my fault. That is semi-hydro substrates such as leca or pon. Now, I have tried to use these over the last maybe 2 years, and I've just never been successful at it. Now, I take full responsibility for that. I don't think I ever fully use them correctly in terms of like the fertilizer I'm meant to use and washing the leca balls and things like that. It just never really took off for me. I think it just didn't suit my plant style, and I don't know if I was willing to give it enough of a chance to buy all of the stuff and actually do it correctly, and so obviously it didn't work because I didn't do that. On top of that, like I just mentioned, I do use a lot of kind of organic materials for growing plants up on, such as branches, and with leca that was just never going to work because I couldn't put it in the same pot or the wood would be rotting, and it wouldn't work on the outside of the pot anyway for stability, so it just didn't really suit my style of growing. on top of that, it just made me realize that soil growing is what I love. It suits me and I'm going to stick to that. So I'm not going to go, I don't think I'm going to go back to that, honestly. Which is annoying because I do think there's a lot to be said for the success people have growing semi-hydro, as well as I really like the idea that it's one substrate, leca or pon, etc., that is used across all of your plants. Obviously that's probably smarter financially, and I question the sustainability of it as well, as like it probably is quite sustainable because you can wash the leca balls or boil them in between using them for different things. Maybe never say never, maybe I will give it another go, but it just hasn't worked for me. It's not something I use anymore, and I mean, it obviously isn't necessary. It's just a different style of growing that you can try if you want. Personally, it just hasn't worked for me this far, and that is absolutely my fault. The final thing is one that I don't know if I've heard that much about since I started being quite serious about the hobby like 3 years ago, and that is diatomaceous earth. Now, because I spoke about this steep learning curve with plants, that also came with a steep learning curve of pests. And I feel like I kind of frantically tried to do everything in a non-chemical and organic way of trying to manage pest populations when I was buying new frickin' plants every 2 weeks and introducing constant changes into the environment and different pests and things dying, and it was just like chaos. But one thing I did use was diatomaceous earth. Now, if you don't know what that is, it is basically a very fine white powder that is used, actually, it's like food grade, so it's used in sterilizing food and things like that, making sure pests aren't on food. You can buy them in a big bucket. I don't think it's quite expensive, and you need to use very little of it if you're using it in your pest treatment. So essentially what it does is very, very fine. You'd sprinkle it on the top of the soil, and basically it's very like sharp on a kind of cellular level, I think, and it kind of bursts the bodies of soft-bodied pest insects and eggs and stuff like that. So it would kind of kill them in that way, which sounds horrible, but it is organic. It's also, you can eat it, it's safe for pets, it's non-toxic, etc., etc. So that's why it kind of seemed like a thing I'd like to try. Now, I'm not sure if it ever fully worked for me. I think it probably would on a small scale if you didn't have a massive infestation. I did try putting it on the leaves of some plants and that did not go well, so it's definitely not something for pests that take over the leaves. You probably have to use it in combination with other things, which organic pest treatment, you kind of have to do that anyway. It's just something that I never really felt, I don't know, that was as effective as, let's say, using soap and water and just dousing your plant in that, which is my choice these days. So yeah, I just don't really feel that it's something necessary. It's something I used to use a lot and don't use anymore. Who's to say that if I used it now, when I'm not introducing new plants and new pests all the time, that it would actually work more effectively? I'm not quite sure. But it is something that I don't feel is necessary. Of course, there are way other, probably more effective methods that you can use only one thing and it just gets rid of whatever pests are on your plant. So that is it for this list. I didn't want to make it super long because there's a lot to chat about in each one of these. And there's definitely more I probably could think of, but these were the ones that stuck out for me as things I kind of regularly used about 3 years ago. So I am thinking of doing a couple of more videos along this kind of type of, maybe for people that are starting to get into plants and trying to navigate all the like crazy variables that happen in plant care, from, you know, watering and very basic things like that, products you need, products you don't need, what is actually important when you're starting out and things to notice, etc., etc. Now, my Plant Basics series, I think, does do a good kind of sciencey background to that, but some people don't enjoy that and just want me to just shout out the basics straight for you, and maybe you don't want to know about the background. That's totally fine also. So, more to come on this. If you did enjoy this video, please let me know by giving it a like, comment or subscribe if you want to see more content from me. Let me know if you agree with any of these, particularly maybe the more controversial ones as well. Is there anything that you used a lot at the beginning of your hobby and now definitely don't use? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I would just like to thank my lovely patrons for supporting me this month. Thank you to Michael, Amy, Grace and Yaindi for all of your support. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you very soon in the next one. Bye.